You think I'm here to play handyman? Bleach it and stop whining, Carl Kessler spat, his voice curling with contempt, standing in the doorway like a gatekeeper of decay who had decided black lungs were expendable. The first time Danielle Brooks noticed the smell, it was just a faint whiff, a sour, damp odor, drifting from somewhere near the kitchen. She paused mid-step, hands still wet from washing dishes, and sniffed the air. It wasn't the trash. That had gone out hours ago. It wasn't the fridge either, she'd cleaned it last night. It was something heavier, something that clung to the back of her throat like wet cloth. Andre was on the living room rug, drawing with the stub of a crayon. He didn't look up as she crossed the apartment, her sneakers sticking faintly to the linoleum in the kitchen. It was coming from under the sink. Danielle knelt, pulled open the cabinet, and recoiled. The back wall was streaked with dark, fuzzy spots, black and green blotches, spreading like a rash across the warped plywood. She touched the wood, damp. A slow, cold drip pattered from the pipe onto the swelling baseboard. Her stomach knotted. Not again. She grabbed a rag, wiped at the mold. The cloth came back stained, smelling faintly of rot. She tossed it in the trash and shut the cabinet door hard, as though the sound could seal it away. By the next morning, the smell was worse. Andre coughed while brushing his teeth, a wet, rattling cough that made Danielle's skin prickle. He'd had a cold a few weeks ago, nothing serious, but this was different. "Drink some water," she told him, watching his small hands grip the plastic cup. His curls stuck damply to his forehead. He was warm but not fever-hot. "Mommy, my chest feels funny," he said softly, rubbing at his ribs. She crouched to meet his eyes. "Like what, baby? Like there's something in there?" Scratching around. Her hand tightened around the toothbrush. "It's just a cough. You'll be fine." But when she sent him off to school, she couldn't shake the sound of that cough. By Thursday, the spots under the sink had doubled in size. They were climbing up the wall now, dark veins spreading toward the counter. Danielle called the landlord. Carl Kessler's voice crackled on the other end, slow and disinterested. "Yeah? It's Danielle Brooks from 3B. We've got mold under the kitchen sink again. You just cleaned that a few months ago, right? Must be you letting it get damp again." "It's from the pipes," she said tightly. "There's a leak." "Look, Miss Brooks," he interrupted. "You people are always calling about something. You want me to send a plumber for every drip? Maybe stop pouring water down the sink." Danielle bit back a response. "My son's been coughing. This could be dangerous." "It's mold," he said flatly. "It's not going to kill anybody. Put some bleach on it." The line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand until the screen dimmed. Saturday morning, she woke to the sound of Andre coughing in his sleep. She went to check on him, pulling the thin blanket up over his shoulders. The room felt damp, the air heavy with that same musty tang. She glanced at the corner near the window. Black specks were creeping along the sill. Her chest tightened. She spent the day scrubbing with bleach, the sharp chemical sting burning her nose. By evening her eyes watered from the fumes, but the mold still clung stubbornly to the walls, its edges soft and alive. The week after, the smell became part of everything: her clothes, Andre's backpack, the couch cushions. She tried baking soda, vinegar, even candles. Nothing helped. Andre came home from school pale and tired. "My head hurts," he murmured, curling up on the couch. She touched his forehead warm again. "You're staying home tomorrow," she said. He nodded weakly. Tuesday night she found him sitting cross-legged on the floor of his room, drawing with quiet focus. "What are you making?" she asked. He held it up. A crayon picture of their apartment, except the walls were alive, covered in black, twisting shapes with eyes. "They're the monsters," he said simply. Her throat went dry. "What monsters?" "The ones on the walls. They crawl at night. They come when you're sleeping." She forced a laugh she didn't feel. "That's just your imagination." But that night, lying in bed, she couldn't stop picturing those twisting shapes, creeping closer while the city outside slept. 2 days later, she opened the kitchen cabinet and froze. The mold had spread halfway up the wall, thick and velvety. Tiny black spores dusted the dishes on the bottom shelf. The air inside was humid, oppressive. She slammed the door shut, but it was too late. The image was seared into her mind. Her skin crawled. She grabbed her phone and dialed Kessler. Again? He didn't answer. She left a message, voice shaking. "Carl, this isn't safe. My son is sick. You need to send someone today." No response. Friday was humid and gray. Danielle came home from work to find Andre asleep on the couch, his cheeks flushed. She touched his forehead hotter now. His breathing was shallow, wheezy. "Baby? Wake up for me." He stirred, opening his eyes. "My chest hurts." She grabbed her bag. "We're going to the A." The emergency room was loud and bright, full of coughing patients, and the distant beep of monitors. Andre sat slumped in a chair, head against her arm. A nurse called them back after 30 minutes. A young resident listened to Andre's lungs, frowning. "How long has he been coughing like this?" "A couple of weeks. It's getting worse." "Any exposure to allergens? Pets? Dust?" Danielle hesitated. "We've got mold in the apartment." "A lot of it." The resident's eyebrows rose. "Black mold?" "I don't know. It's dark, spreading fast." He stepped out, returning with another doctor, a tall black man with kind eyes and a serious expression. His badge read Dr. Ellis. He examined Andre carefully, asking gentle questions. Then he turned to Danielle. "Mold exposure can cause respiratory distress, especially in children. This could be serious." She swallowed hard. "I've tried to get the landlord to fix it. He won't." "Then you need to get him out of there," Dr. Ellis said. "Soon. If you stay in that apartment, it might kill him." Back home, Danielle sat on the couch, long after Andre had gone to bed, the weight of Dr. Ellis's words pressing on her chest. She looked around at the peeling paint, the cracked tiles, the shadows in the corners. The monsters on the walls weren't imaginary, and they were getting closer. The sound of his breathing would haunt her for the rest of her life. Raspy, shallow, desperate, as though every breath Andre took was an uphill climb. Danielle dropped to her knees on the cold kitchen tile, panic pounding in her chest. "Baby, look at me," she pleaded, lifting his chin. His eyes were half-lidded, unfocused, his lips tinged a worrying shade of blue. "Andre, stay with me." Her shaking hands fumbled for the phone. She dialed 911. "My son, he can't breathe. Please, send someone now." 342 Glenwood, apartment 3B. The operator's calm voice said something about staying on the line, but Danielle was already sliding an arm under Andre, pulling him close. He was so light, his body trembling against hers. She kept talking to him, her words spilling out in a frantic rhythm. "You're okay. You're gonna be okay. I've got you. Mommy's got you." The paramedics arrived within minutes, bursting into the apartment with a rush of cool night air. Their boots thudded against the floor as they set down equipment. "How long's he been like this?" one asked, already placing an oxygen mask over Andre's mouth. "It just happened, I don't know, a few minutes," Danielle said, voice cracking. The medic glanced toward the kitchen. "What's that smell?" Her jaw tightened. "Mold. The landlord won't fix it." He didn't comment, just exchanged a glance with his partner. They lifted Andre onto the stretcher, his small fingers twitching weakly as they secured him. Danielle grabbed her bag and followed them out, her heart hammering against her ribs. At the ER, Dr. Ellis was waiting. He must have been on shift again. He moved quickly, directing nurses to run tests, start 4 fluids, and check oxygen saturation. Danielle stood frozen by the door until he turned to her. His oxygen levels were dangerously low when they brought him in. "He's stable now, but this is not a mild case," Dr. Ellis said firmly. "We're admitting him." The words hit her like a blow. He lowered his voice. "This isn't just a cold, Miss Brooks. I suspect he has a severe reaction to prolonged mold exposure. We'll run blood work and imaging, but you can't keep living in that apartment." "I can't just move," she said bitterly. "I can barely pay for the one we have." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I understand." But if the environment is making him sick, it's not safe. I'll document everything for you." She realized then that this wasn't just about medicine. He was offering her ammunition, something to fight with. The next morning she called Kessler. To her surprise, he answered. "Mr. Kessler, it's Danielle Brooks from 3B, she said tightly. "My son is in the hospital because of the mold in your building." A pause. Then, "What?" "He can't breathe. The doctor says it's from exposure. You have to send someone to fix it." He cut her off with a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, come on. You think a little mold put your kid in the hospital? Sounds like you're just looking for someone to blame." Danielle's voice shook, but she didn't stop. "I have medical documentation. If you don't, that's the problem with you people," he snapped. "Always exaggerating, always complaining. You want a luxury apartment, go get a better job." The words hit like ice water. She'd heard them before, in a dozen forms, but never so plainly. "You're responsible for maintaining that property," she said, her voice low now. "You don't get to treat tenants like garbage because they're black." Silence crackled down the line. Then he said, "Watch yourself, Miss Brooks," and hung up. By the time she returned to the hospital, Andre was sitting up, pale but awake, drawing in a notebook the nurses had given him. More monsters. This time they had sharp teeth and long arms reaching into a bed. She kissed his forehead and sat beside him. "Mommy, is the mold going to come here too?" he asked quietly. "No, baby," she said, forcing a smile. "You're safe here?" That afternoon, she took her phone into the hallway and started making calls. City Housing Authority. She was on hold for 20 minutes before a bored-sounding clerk told her to file a complaint online. Tenant Rights Hotline. The woman on the line was sympathetic but overworked. "We can send someone for an inspection," she said. "But it could take weeks." "We don't have weeks," Danielle said. "He's in the hospital." "I'm sorry, ma'am." "I wish I could do more." She returned to Andre's room, defeated, and found Dr. Ellis reviewing his chart. "His chest X-ray shows inflammation consistent with mold exposure," he said. "It's not just in his lungs, it's in his bloodstream. We're treating him with antifungal medication and steroids." Danielle swallowed hard. "What happens if he goes back home?" He didn't sugarcoat it. "He'll get worse, much worse." She sat heavily in the chair. "Then I guess we can't go back." That night she stayed in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, watching Andre sleep. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only thing keeping her grounded. Her phone buzzed around midnight. A text from an unknown number. "You think you can smear my name? You'll regret it." Her stomach turned. She didn't need to guess who it was from. The next morning she found a new number to call. A tenants advocacy group she'd read about in an old news article. A woman named Ruth picked up. "We handle cases of landlord negligence, especially in low-income communities," Ruth explained. "If you have medical proof, we can connect you to legal aid." "I do," Danielle said. "I also have pictures of the mold." "Good. Send them over. And if you can, start a log. Every call you make, every conversation, every threat. Write it down." Danielle started a notebook that afternoon. 3 days later, Andre was stable enough to be discharged, with strict instructions to avoid exposure to mold or damp environments. Dr. Ellis handed her a thick folder of medical records. "I'm not exaggerating when I say this could have killed him," he said. "You need to get the city involved." She promised she would. Back at the apartment, the smell hit them before they even reached the door. Danielle unlocked it slowly, as though expecting something to leap out. Inside, it was worse than she remembered. The kitchen cabinet was nearly black with growth. The corner by the window in Andre's room was damp and spongy to the touch. A faint haze of spores floated in the afternoon light. Andre clung to her leg. "Mommy, it got bigger." She grabbed her phone and began taking pictures from every angle. She sent them to Ruth, who replied almost instantly. "Got them. We'll contact the Department of Buildings and try to fast-track an inspection. But brace yourself, landlords like this don't go quietly." Danielle didn't need the warning. That night she dreamed of the monsters. Not the ones Andre drew, these were worse. They had Carl Kessler's face, grinning, while mold poured from his mouth like smoke. She woke gasping, the real smell still thick in the air. The next morning she found an envelope slid under the door. Inside was a handwritten note in blocky letters. "Stop making trouble, or I'll make sure you're out on the street." Her hands shook. She shoved the note into her new evidence folder. In the afternoon she sat at the kitchen table and called Kessler one last time. "This is harassment," she said the moment he picked up. "I have everything documented. Pictures, medical records, threats. If you don't fix this, I'm going to the press." He chuckled, low and mocking. "Go ahead. Nobody cares about another whiny tenant in Glenwood. You'll be gone before anyone prints your story." Her jaw clenched. "We'll see." That night, Andre coughed himself awake 3 times. Danielle sat beside him, stroking his hair, rage building in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for repairs anymore. She was fighting for war. Andre didn't like the men in uniforms. They didn't look like the kind of heroes from his picture books. These men didn't have capes or shiny armor. They had clipboards and bored eyes. One had crumbs in his beard. The other smelled like cigarette smoke. They walked into the apartment without smiling at him, without even looking at him. His mommy followed them, talking fast. "The mold's under the sink. It's in his room, too. The smell, it's making him sick. My son's been hospitalized." The taller one crouched by the kitchen cabinet, peeled it open, and made a sound like, He didn't write anything down. The other one ran a hand over the warped floorboard and glanced at the ceiling. Andre hung back in the hallway, clutching the edge of the wall. The monsters weren't hiding today. They were right there, watching. Black patches breathing slowly, like they were waiting. He imagined they could hear the men talking, maybe even understand them. "Doesn't look that bad," the shorter inspector said. "Not that bad?" Danielle's voice was sharp. "It's spreading. It's in the walls. Look at the pictures I sent. My son can't breathe in here." The taller one finally straightened. "We'll file the report," he said in a voice that didn't mean anything. "But it's up to the owner to arrange remediation. We can't force him unless it's an immediate hazard." Danielle stared at him. "A child in the hospital isn't immediate?" The men exchanged a look that Andre didn't understand, but he could feel the grown-up kind of bad in it, the kind that meant nothing was going to happen. "Have a good day, ma'am," one said, already heading for the door. When they were gone, Danielle stood still for a long moment, her fists tight. Then she grabbed her phone and stepped into the kitchen to call someone. Andre didn't listen this time. He didn't need to. He already knew Mommy was fighting the monsters, and the monsters were winning. That night, the scratching came back. It wasn't real scratching, not like a cat or mouse. It was more like the sound of paper crumpling slowly, deep inside the walls. Andre lay in bed, staring at the dark patch on the corner by his window. It was bigger now, almost as tall as his toy shelf. He imagined a long arm pushing from the other side, fingers made of black fuzz, reaching for him. He pulled the blanket over his head and tried to breathe quietly. But the air under the blanket was heavy and hot, and he started coughing again. Mommy came in quickly, rubbing his back. "It's okay, baby, you're okay." But her eyes flicked to the wall, and he could tell she was scared, too. The next morning, Danielle took photos again, this time with a ruler next to the spots, to show how much they'd grown. She measured the dark patch in Andre's room. It was spreading about an inch every 2 days. She sent the photos to Ruth at the Tenants Advocacy Group. Ruth called back within the hour. "Danielle, I've seen cases like this. If your landlord's connected to the inspection department, they can make things disappear. But there's another route. We go public." Danielle hesitated. "You mean news?" "I mean news," Ruth said. "Do you want me to connect you to a reporter?" Danielle thought of Kessler's smirk in the hallway, the note under her door, the inspector shrugging like her child's life was a minor inconvenience. "Yes," she said. That's how she met Lena Park. They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks away, where the air didn't smell like damp rot. Lena was younger than Danielle expected, with sharp eyes and a notepad already open. "Ruth told me what's going on," Lena said. "I want to see it for myself, but first, I need to know if you're ready for backlash. Once this goes public, Kessler will come after you." Danielle's hands curled around her paper cup. "He's already coming after me." They went back to the apartment together. Andre clung to Danielle's leg, watching as Lena moved through the rooms, snapping photos, crouching low to examine the walls. "This is extensive," Lena murmured. "And you've been living here how long? 3 years? Has he ever done proper maintenance?" Danielle laughed without humor. "Only when white tenants complain." Later, Lena asked if she could talk to Andre. Danielle hesitated, but Andre nodded. He sat at the table with his crayons, drawing another picture of the monsters. This time they had teeth as big as his arm. "They come from the wall," he explained to Lena seriously. "And they eat the air so you can't breathe." Lena looked at Danielle, her expression unreadable. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "kids tell the truth better than adults can." That evening, after Lena left, Danielle felt a strange mix of hope and dread. Hope, because someone was finally listening. Dread, because she knew Kessler wouldn't take it lying down. 2 nights later, her phone buzzed at 2 a.m. It was a text from an unknown number. "Hope your little boy likes hospitals. Might be going back soon." Her stomach turned to ice. She didn't sleep again that night, pacing between Andre's room and the kitchen. Andre's coughing grew worse. Dr. Ellis prescribed a stronger inhaler, but warned that it was a temporary measure. "Every day in that apartment is another day of exposure," he said. "This is only buying you time." Danielle started leaving the windows open, even in the cold, just to keep the air moving. But the smell was still there, crawling into their clothes, their hair. One afternoon she came home from work to find Andre sitting cross-legged in the middle of his room, talking quietly to the wall. "What are you doing, baby?" she asked. "They said they're not going away," he said matter-of-factly. She crouched beside him, heart racing. "Who said?" "The monsters. They said this is their house now." The next day, Lena came back with a small camera. "Hidden," she explained. "I want to catch him admitting something." They placed it in the kitchen, angled toward the cabinet. Danielle called Kessler and left a message saying the mold was worse, hoping he'd show up in person. He did, 3 days later, stopping in without knocking. Danielle kept her voice calm. "You need to fix this." He crouched, looked under the sink, and laughed. "Looks fine to me. You probably made it worse on purpose. Some people will do anything for a free ride." Danielle felt heat rise in her chest. "My son is sick." "That's your problem, not mine," he said, standing. "If you don't like it here, leave." He left without touching a single thing. When Lena retrieved the camera, she grinned. "We got him." The audio's crystal clear. But that small victory was short-lived. The next morning, Danielle found another envelope under her door. Inside, an eviction notice. Danielle sat at the table staring at the eviction notice until the lines of printed text blurred together. The words felt unreal, like something from a bad dream. The date gave her only 30 days. She kept thinking of the boxes she didn't have, the money she didn't have, and the places she couldn't afford. She kept thinking of Andre's drawings, the monsters growing bigger every time, and how moving wouldn't change the fact that they were already inside him. She called Ruth first. "They can't just throw you out because you asked for repairs," Ruth said sharply. "That's retaliatory eviction, and it's illegal. But proving it," she paused. "That's where it gets tricky. He'll make up a reason. Noise complaints, property damage, anything." "You have any neighbors willing to testify?" Danielle glanced at the ceiling. She knew the young couple above her barely spoke to anyone, and Mrs. Jennings next door always kept her curtains closed. "I don't think so. They're scared of him." "That's how he keeps control," Ruth said. "Fear and silence. But there's always someone who's seen enough to talk." The next day, Danielle began knocking on doors. Most opened just far enough for a face to appear, then closed again with polite refusals. Some didn't open at all. By the time she reached the far end of the hall, she was ready to give up. Then the door to 3A opened a crack. It was Mr. Alvarez, a thin man with deep lines in his face and a voice that rasped like paper. He'd moved out months ago, but Danielle remembered seeing him around. "You're still here," she said. "Just packing the last of my things," he replied. "But not for long." His eyes darted down the hall. "You should be careful." "Careful of what?" "Of who," he corrected. "Kessler doesn't like people making noise. I made noise. About the leaks. About the heat going out in winter. About the mold." Danielle stepped closer. "There was mold in your place, too?" He nodded. "My grandson got sick. Coughing. Fevers. Doctor said it was the air. I called the city. Called everybody. A week later, Kessler came to me with a deal. Cash to break the lease and keep quiet." Danielle felt her stomach turn. "And you took it?" "I couldn't fight him," Mr. Alvarez said quietly. "Not with the money he has. And I couldn't let my grandson stay in that place one more day." He hesitated, then pulled open a drawer by the door. From inside he took a folder, thick with papers. "I kept the records. Just in case." Danielle accepted it with both hands. Inside were printed copies of his complaints to the housing authority, medical bills for his grandson, and letters from Kessler's office. One letter was an agreement to vacate in exchange for a payment of $2,000 signed by Kessler himself. Back in her apartment, Danielle spread the papers across the table. She called Lena immediately. "This is gold," Lena said after Danielle explained. "It proves a pattern: neglect, retaliation, payoffs. If we can find more tenants with stories like this, we can show it's not just your apartment." They made a plan. Lena would dig into city records to see how many violations had been reported at Kessler's properties. Danielle would talk to more tenants, even in other buildings he owned. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a haze of work, hospital visits for Andre's follow-ups and knocking on strangers' doors. Some were polite but distant. Others, once they realized she wasn't from the landlord's office, began talking in low, urgent voices. One woman in another building described a leak so bad it caved in part of her ceiling. Another said she'd been without heat for a month in winter, while Kessler ignored her calls. Several mentioned mold, always dismissed by the same inspectors. Meanwhile, Lena uncovered a web of connections between Kessler and a handful of city employees, including one who processed inspection reports. More than a dozen complaints against his buildings had been marked resolved, with no follow-up visits. Danielle began to understand just how deep the rot went. One evening after Andre had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with Lena and Ruth, the folder from Mr. Alvarez open between them. "This is enough to push for a formal investigation," Ruth said, "but the more public pressure, the better. We should organize a tenants' meeting, maybe even a protest." Danielle hesitated. "If we do that, he'll come after me harder." Ruth looked her in the eye. "He already is. The eviction notice is proof of that. The difference is, if you do this publicly, you won't be alone when he comes." They set the date for the meeting Saturday afternoon in the courtyard between the buildings. Lena promised to bring a photographer. Ruth would invite other tenant groups. On the morning of the meeting, Danielle woke to find another envelope under her door. This one wasn't typed. The block letters were the same as before. "Cancel your little gathering or I'll cancel your lease tomorrow." She folded it in half and slipped it into her evidence folder. The courtyard filled slowly at first, a few cautious faces peeking out from doorways. Then more came residents from other buildings, some carrying signs, others just standing together in the open for the first time. Lena moved through the crowd with her camera, capturing the turnout. Danielle stood on the low step near the laundry room and told her story. She spoke about the mold, the hospital visits, the inspectors who shrugged, the eviction notice, and the threats. She held up photos of the walls in her apartment, the medical bills for Andre's care. When she finished, there was a ripple through the crowd, people calling out their own stories, pointing to broken stairs, leaking roofs, infestations. The air felt electric, a current of anger and solidarity passing between strangers. By the time the protest signs were lifted, even the hesitant ones were chanting, It didn't take long for Kessler to appear. He came out of the building with two men in plain clothes who looked like hired muscle. His face twisted into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Nice party," he called over the noise. "Hope you all enjoy it while it lasts." Nobody moved. Lena raised her camera and snapped a photo as he turned and walked away. That night, Danielle's phone buzzed with a text from Ruth. "City Inspector's Office just announced an emergency review of Kessler's properties. We're making noise." The next few days were a blur of phone calls and interviews. Lena's first article went live online, a headline with Kessler's name in bold. A photo of the mold under Danielle's sink and Andre's inhaler lying beside it. The story spread quickly, shared on social media, with comments from other tenants in the city. Danielle knew it was only the beginning, but for the first time in weeks, she felt the edge of something she hadn't dared to believe in momentum. Even Andre seemed lighter, though he still coughed at night. He showed her a new drawing, this one different from the others. The monsters were still there, but in front of them stood a crowd of stick figures holding signs. Some had their arms linked. "What's this?" Danielle asked. "It's us," he said simply. "We're bigger now." The second article hit harder than the first. Lena had managed to get 3 other former tenants on record, all telling nearly identical stories: mold, leaks, no repairs, and then the same pattern of intimidation or cash offers to keep quiet. She also published an audio clip from Danielle's kitchen, where Kessler's voice could be heard laughing. "That's your problem, not mine," when confronted about the mold. The calls started coming in almost immediately. Local radio wanted an interview. A community activist group reached out offering legal support. Even a council member's office called to express concern. But with the attention came something darker. The threats got worse. Danielle woke one morning to find LIAR spray-painted across her apartment door in jagged red letters. Andre saw it before she could stop him. "Why are they mad at you?" he asked quietly. She crouched down and met his eyes. "Because I'm telling the truth, and sometimes people don't like hearing the truth." He thought about that for a moment, then nodded. "But we have to tell it anyway, right?" "Yes, baby, always." She spent the next hour scrubbing at the paint until her hands ached, but the faint outlines still showed in the wood. That afternoon she met Lena at the coffee shop again. Lena had a thin folder tucked under her arm, and a look that was equal parts excitement and exhaustion. "City inspectors are scheduled for a surprise sweep of all Kessler's buildings tomorrow," she said, sliding the folder across the table. "But here's the kicker: 2 of them are being accompanied by the Department of Public Health. That's rare." Danielle flipped through the documents inside. Inspection records, violation histories, and photos Lena had gotten from other tenants. Some of the mold damage was worse than hers. Whole ceilings blackened, water running down walls, mushrooms sprouting from baseboards. "I want you there tomorrow," Lena said. "When they inspect your place, I want your face on camera with them. People need to see who's living through this." Danielle hesitated. "Won't that make him angrier?" Lena leaned forward. "He's already angry. The difference now is he's losing control of the story." The next day, Danielle stood in her kitchen as 2 inspectors in white coveralls and masks moved slowly through the apartment, their gloved hands brushing against walls and pipes. One of them knelt to take a swab from under the sink. The other poked a moisture meter into the wall by Andre's window and shook his head. "This isn't just surface mold," the taller one said. "It's inside the walls. Judging by the readings, it's been here for years." Danielle glanced toward the doorway, where Kessler stood with his arms crossed, glaring. "Is that in your report?" She asked the inspector loudly enough for the camera crew to catch it. The inspector nodded. "It'll be documented," Kessler snorted. "Doesn't mean anything until the city says it does." The shorter inspector turned toward him. "Sir, this qualifies as a Class 2 health hazard. If you don't act, the city can order remediation at your expense." For the first time since this began, Danielle saw something flicker across Kessler's face, something that looked a lot like worry. 2 days later, the notice went up on the building's front door. Emergency repair order. Department of Public Health. It was a small victory, but it didn't feel like enough. The mold was still there. Andre was still sick. And Kessler was still her landlord for now. That night, she found another envelope under her door. This one contained a single sheet of paper with a blurry photo of her and Andre leaving the hospital, circled in red marker. No words, just the picture. She showed it to Ruth the next morning. "That's intimidation," Ruth said flatly. "We'll add it to the legal complaint. The more he does this, the worse it looks for him." Andre's health was up and down. Some days he seemed almost himself, running little races down the hall and asking for his favorite spaghetti. Other days he woke wheezing and pale, refusing to eat. Dr. Ellis adjusted his medications again, but warned Danielle that no treatment would fully work until they were out of the apartment. She spent hours scrolling through rental listings, but everything in their price range was either too far from her job or barely better than where they were now. The waiting lists for affordable housing were months long. One evening, Andre sat at the table with his crayons while Danielle made calls about an apartment that had just been posted. He was unusually quiet. When she looked over, he was drawing a building on fire, the black monsters curling up into the smoke. "What's that?" she asked gently. "It's the only way to make them go away," he said without looking up. The answer made her chest ache. She didn't correct him. How could she, when she sometimes thought the same thing? Lena's third article dropped a week later. This one wasn't just about Kessler. It was about the city's failure to enforce its own housing laws. She'd gotten quotes from former inspectors who claimed they were pressured to close out complaints without visiting the sites. She also published the photo of the spray-painted word on Danielle's door, alongside the timeline of hospital visits and eviction notices. The reaction was immediate. Community leaders began calling for Kessler's license to be revoked. A petition circulated online, gathering thousands of signatures. And then came the news that made Danielle sit down before she fell down. The city attorney's office had opened a criminal negligence investigation. She was sitting with Andre in the living room when the call came from Ruth. "This is big, Danielle. This means they're looking at potential charges. If it sticks, he could face jail time." Danielle glanced at her son, who was building a little fort out of couch cushions. She thought about the first night she smelled the damp under the sink, about the dismissive voice on the phone, about all the times she'd been told to bleach it and move on. She didn't smile, not yet, but she felt something shift in her chest, something that might be the start of relief. The next morning, police cars pulled up in front of the building. Danielle stood at her window and watched as uniformed officers escorted Kessler out in handcuffs. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, some snapping photos, others clapping or shouting. Andre pressed his face to the glass. "They're taking the monster away?" She pulled him close. Something like that. But she knew this wasn't over. Repairs would take months, maybe longer. Finding a safe place to live was still urgent. And there were other landlords just like him, running the same game on tenants, without the time or resources to fight back. For now, though, she allowed herself to sit with Andre on the couch, breathing in the rare stillness. For the first time in weeks, the air felt a little lighter. The morning after Kessler's arrest, Danielle woke to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. It was barely 6:30 a.m., but the notifications were relentless texts from friends she hadn't spoken to in years, voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize, and a flood of emails with subject lines like "Saw you on the news" and "Tenant Hero." She rubbed her eyes and reached for the remote. Every local station seemed to be running the same footage. Kessler in handcuffs, head down, being escorted out of the building by 2 officers. The anchors spoke in clipped, serious tones about criminal negligence and multiple counts of housing fraud. Andre padded into the living room, still in his pajamas, hair sticking up. "Is he gone?" he asked, eyes fixed on the screen. "For now," Danielle said carefully, "but that doesn't mean everything's fixed." He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. Then he climbed into her lap and whispered, "It feels different today." She kissed the top of his head. "Yeah, baby, it does." By mid-morning, the courtyard outside was buzzing. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for months now lingered in clusters, talking in low voices about the arrest. Some looked relieved, others wary. Danielle could feel the shift in the air, a crack in the fear that had kept everyone silent for so long. But she also knew better than to think they were safe. The building hadn't changed overnight. The mold was still in the walls. The leaks still ran down the stairwells. And the eviction notice Kessler had served her before his arrest was still taped to her refrigerator. Ruth called just after noon. The city's assigned a temporary property manager to oversee the building while the case moves forward. That's good news. It means Kessler can't interfere. But you and Andre still need to get out of that apartment. "I've been looking," Danielle said, pacing the kitchen. "But everything in our range is either falling apart or miles away from Andre's school, and the waiting lists for decent places, months long." "I know," Ruth said, "but with all this media attention, there might be short-term options. I'll make some calls to the nonprofits I know." 3 days later, Lena showed up at Danielle's door with her camera slung over her shoulder and a bag of groceries. "You're practically famous now," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "People keep emailing me asking how they can help." Danielle shook her head. "I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Lena said firmly. "It's solidarity. You've done what a lot of people couldn't. You stood up to someone who thought they were untouchable. People want to support you because your fight is their fight." Danielle took the groceries out, slowly: milk, bread, fresh fruit, things she hadn't been able to splurge on lately. "I don't feel like I'm winning," she admitted. "You're not done yet," Lena said. "But you've already changed the rules of the game." Living in the apartment had become almost unbearable. Even with the windows cracked open, despite the cold, the smell lingered, damp, bitter, inescapable. Andre's cough returned within days of being discharged from the hospital. At night, Danielle would wake to the sound of his wheezing and sit beside him until his breathing steadied. One night she found him standing in the hallway at 3 a.m, silent and pale. "They were in my dream again," he whispered. She crouched down and held him close. "It's just a dream." "But they said they're still here," he murmured into her shoulder. She looked past him at the blackened patch on the wall, and for a moment it didn't feel like a dream at all. The new property manager arrived the following week. Her name was Marisol Vega, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She toured the building with a team of contractors, stopping at each hallway to jot down notes. When she stepped into Danielle's apartment, she paused mid-step. "This is worse than I was told," she said, her voice tight. Danielle gave a dry laugh. "You don't say." "We'll be starting full mold remediation next week," Marisol said. "But you can't be here while that's happening. The spores will get worse before they get better." Danielle frowned. "I can't just disappear for a week." "Then I'll make sure we find you somewhere to go," Marisol said. "Nobody should be living in this right now." 2 days later, Ruth called with news that felt like a lifeline. "I found an organization that does emergency relocation for tenants in unsafe conditions," she said. "They've got a temporary furnished unit available for you, clean, safe, and close to Andre's school." Danielle sat down at the kitchen table. "You're serious?" "Has a heart attack. It's temporary, 3 months max, but it'll get you both out of there until we find something permanent." Danielle felt a lump in her throat. "That's 3 months more than I had yesterday." Moving day came quickly. Volunteers from the advocacy group arrived with boxes and gloves, carefully packing only what could be cleaned. Most of the furniture was left behind. It was too contaminated. Andre's drawings were stacked gently in a folder. The new apartment was small, but the walls were white and unmarked. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner instead of rot. Andre ran from room to room, opening every door. "They can't find us here," he said with a grin. Danielle hugged him tight. "Not here." In the weeks that followed, the case against Kessler grew. Prosecutors added charges as more tenants came forward. Lena's reporting gained national traction, and housing advocates began calling for new laws to prevent landlords from retaliating against tenants who reported violations. Ruth urged Danielle to use the momentum. If you want permanent housing, now's the time to push. Politicians love being seen solving high-profile problems. Danielle hesitated. She wasn't comfortable being a public face. But then she thought of the spray-painted word on her old door, the photos of Andre's inhaler next to the black mold, and the quiet dread that had hung over their home for months. She agreed. 2 weeks later, she stood on the steps of City Hall, speaking into a cluster of microphones. "My son almost died because a landlord decided that profit mattered more than people," she said, voice steady despite the cameras. "This isn't just about us, it's about every family living in fear of speaking up because they can't afford to lose their home." Andre stood beside her, holding her hand, wearing his best sweater. Lena moved around the edges of the crowd, snapping photos. Afterward, several housing advocates approached with offers of help. One introduced her to a lawyer who specialized in class action lawsuits. "You have a strong case," he said. "Not just for damages, but for setting a legal precedent. If you're willing, we can file on behalf of every tenant Kessler's harmed." Danielle didn't answer right away. She thought about the toll the fight had already taken, about how much more there was still to do. But when she looked down at Andre's small hand in hers, she knew she couldn't stop now. By the end of the month, the suit was filed. More than a dozen tenants signed on, with more adding their names each week. Lena's headline the next morning read, "Tenants Unite. Landmark Lawsuit Targets Slumlord Practices." The comment section was flooded with stories from other cities, from people who had lived through similar nightmares. Some just wrote thank you. Others asked how to join the fight. Danielle read every one of them, knowing that somewhere someone was sitting in a damp apartment, wondering if anyone would believe them. Now maybe they would. The lawsuit filing changed everything. Within days, local talk shows were calling it the biggest tenant-led legal action the city had seen in a decade. Danielle's phone became a revolving door of reporters, housing advocates, and lawyers wanting updates. For every request she accepted, she turned down 2. She still had a job to hold on to, and more importantly, she had Andre's recovery to manage. The temporary apartment had given them breathing space literally and figuratively. The air was clean, and Andre's cough began to ease. His cheeks regained a hint of color. But Dr. Ellis was clear during their checkup. "He's improving, but his immune system's been through a lot. It'll take months before we can say he's out of the woods. Keep monitoring him closely." Danielle nodded. "We're doing everything we can." Dr. Ellis gave a small smile. "You're doing more than most parents could." While Andre healed, the legal case gathered force. The tenant's attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Aisha Karim, met with Danielle and the other plaintiffs every Thursday night in a borrowed conference room. The walls were lined with file boxes, each labeled with dates, addresses, and complaint numbers. Aisha walked them through what to expect. "This isn't going to be quick. Kessler's lawyers will drag this out as long as they can, but the publicity is our advantage. The more eyes on this, the less room they have to maneuver." One evening, she slid a stack of documents toward Danielle. "These are inspection reports from the last 5 years. More than half were marked resolved without any work orders. We've already found 3 inspectors who are willing to testify they were told to close cases without visiting the property." Danielle skimmed the pages. The patterns were obvious: complaints filed, marked resolved within days, no follow-up. How did he get away with this for so long? Aisha's jaw tightened. "Because it's easier to ignore poor tenants than to fight rich landlords. You're about to change that." In the meantime, Lena kept the story alive in the press. Every week, she published another piece: profiles of individual tenants, timelines of ignored violations, breakdowns of the city's failure to enforce its own laws. She didn't just write about Kessler. She wrote about the system that allowed him to thrive. One afternoon, Lena called Danielle unexpectedly. "Pack a nice outfit. There's a rally at the state capitol tomorrow, and you're speaking." Danielle hesitated. "I'm not a politician." "You're a mother who fought back," Lena said. "That's better." The rally was larger than Danielle expected, hundreds of people filling the steps, holding signs that read "Homes are human rights" and "End slumlords now." She stood at the podium, hands trembling slightly as she looked out at the crowd. "I'm here because my son almost died from mold in our apartment," she began. "And when I asked for help, my landlord tried to evict us. He thought we'd be too scared to fight back. He was wrong." The crowd erupted in cheers. Danielle continued, her voice steadying. "This isn't just about one bad landlord. It's about a system that says profit matters more than people. We're here to say that ends now." By the time she stepped down, her hands no longer shook. Andre was in the front row, clapping with a grin so wide it made her heart ache. Behind the scenes, the legal pressure was mounting. Kessler's assets were being audited. Subpoenas went out for financial records, revealing years of unpaid maintenance fines and suspicious consulting payments to city officials. One night after a strategy meeting, Aisha pulled Danielle aside. "We found something big offshore, accounts linked to bribes. This isn't just a housing case anymore. It's criminal corruption." Danielle exhaled slowly. "Does that mean he'll go to prison?" "It means," Aisha said, "that the feds might be getting involved." For the tenants, the lawsuit was more than just a legal battle. It was a shift in confidence. People who once whispered their complaints now spoke loudly at meetings. They compared notes, shared resources, and planned for a future without Kessler looming over them. Danielle noticed it most in Mrs. Jennings, the elderly woman from next door. In the old days, she'd barely crack her door open when Danielle knocked. Now she greeted her in the lobby with updates on the latest court filings, her voice bright with purpose. In early spring, the temporary property manager, Marisol, invited Danielle to walk through the old apartment with the remediation crew. She hadn't been back since moving out, and stepping inside was like opening a wound. The air was thick with chemical cleaners and dust. Walls had been ripped open, revealing wooden studs streaked with black. Under the kitchen sink, the entire cabinet had been torn out, leaving only damp concrete. One of the workers glanced up. "You're the tenant, right? This mold's been here a long time. I'm surprised you're still breathing." Danielle stared at the gaping holes where her cabinets used to be and thought of all the nights she'd cooked dinner with that smell in the air. "Me too," she said quietly. By late March, the case had moved into its discovery phase. Lena's coverage was relentless, and other news outlets began digging into their own local landlord scandals, inspired by the attention Danielle's fight had generated. But the work was exhausting. Between depositions, media appearances, and caring for Andre, Danielle felt stretched to the breaking point. There were moments, late at night, when she wondered if it would be easier to settle, to take a payout and walk away. Then she'd remember Andre's first night in the hospital, his lips tinged blue, and the thought would vanish. In April, the tenants scored their first major win. The judge denied Kessler's motion to dismiss the case, citing substantial evidence of systemic negligence and probable retaliatory behavior. A trial date was set for early the following year. That night, the plaintiffs gathered in the conference room to celebrate with takeout pizza and paper cups of soda. It wasn't a final victory, but it was proof they were on the right track. Andre sat on Danielle's lap, stealing bites from her plate. "When it's over, can we get a place with a yard?" he asked. Danielle smiled. "Yeah, baby. We'll get a yard." The momentum didn't stop at the courtroom. Spurred by public pressure, the city council passed a bill increasing penalties for landlords who failed to address hazardous conditions. It also strengthened protections against retaliatory evictions, something Danielle had fought for in her testimony. When the vote passed, Ruth sent her a simple text: "You did this." By May, Danielle began to see the impact of her fight in the small details of daily life. At Andre's school, other parents she barely knew would stop her to say they'd read her story. A clerk at the grocery store slipped her a coupon book with a whispered, "For the little one." Andre's health was steadily improving. He could run the length of the park without wheezing. The dark circles under his eyes were fading. He laughed more. One afternoon, as they walked home from the park, he pointed at a construction site. "They're fixing that building," he said. "Yeah," Danielle said. "Do you think they had monsters, too?" She squeezed his hand. Not anymore. By the summer, Danielle had stopped thinking of herself as just a victim of what happened. She was a plaintiff, an advocate, and whether she liked it or not, a public figure in the fight for housing justice. There was still a long road ahead. The trial would be grueling, but for the first time she believed they might actually win. And when they did, the monsters wouldn't just be gone from her walls. They'd be gone from a lot of other people's walls, too. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in January, almost a year after Danielle first found the mold under her sink. The courthouse steps were slick with ice, but the plaza outside was packed reporters with cameras, housing activists with signs, and tenants from across the city who had followed the case from the start. Danielle walked up the steps with Andre's small hand in hers. He was bundled in a navy coat and scarf, his curls peeking out from under a knit hat. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "Me too," he said, squeezing her fingers. "But we're bigger than the monsters now." Inside the courtroom, Kessler sat at the defense table in a gray suit, looking smaller than Danielle remembered. The arrogance she'd come to know was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped stillness. His lawyers shuffled papers and whispered to each other. Aisha began her opening statement with precision. "This case is about more than one landlord. It is about a system that allowed a man to collect rent from families while knowingly endangering their lives. And it is about the people like Ms. Danielle Brooks, who refused to be silent." When Danielle took the stand, the room was silent. She spoke about the smell, the spreading black patches, Andre's hospital visits, the threats, and the eviction notice. She described finding her son collapsed on the kitchen floor. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight in her words filled the room. Kessler's lawyer tried to paint her as exaggerating, suggesting her cleaning habits were to blame. Aisha objected, the judge sustained it, and Danielle kept her eyes on the jury, refusing to flinch. Over the next 2 weeks, the court heard from doctors, inspectors, former tenants, and city employees. Dr. Ellis testified about the severity of Andre's condition. Marisol, the temporary property manager, described the mold infestation as one of the worst I've seen in 20 years. Then came the bombshell. Financial records showing Kessler's payments to certain city inspectors. The amounts were substantial. The timing aligned perfectly with closed complaints. And one inspector even testified under immunity that he had been paid to falsify reports. By the time closing arguments came, the jury's expressions told Danielle everything she needed to know. The verdict was delivered on a Thursday afternoon. Danielle sat in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap, feeling Andrew's presence beside her. On the claim of criminal negligence, we find the defendant guilty. On the claim of housing fraud, guilty. On the claim of child endangerment, guilty. The list went on 6 counts in total, all guilty. Kessler showed no reaction, but Danielle felt a rush of air leave her chest, like she'd been holding her breath for a year. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, plus restitution to the tenants. The restitution fund would be split among those affected, and the city was ordered to implement reforms based on the case's findings. Afterward, the courthouse steps were a swirl of reporters and flashing cameras. Danielle gave a brief statement, her voice steady. "This is a victory, but it's not the end. There are still landlords out there doing the same thing. We've shown what's possible when tenants stand together, and we're not done." Andre tugged her sleeve. "Can we go home now?" She smiled. "Yeah, baby. Let's go home." The restitution money wasn't life-changing, but it was enough for a down payment on a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. It had a small yard, a front porch, and sunlight that poured into the living room in the mornings. When they moved in that spring, Andre ran through every room, opening closets and peering under sinks. No monsters, he declared, in each one. They planted flowers in the yard together. Danielle chose marigolds, bright, stubborn things that could survive anything. Andre picked a corner for a vegetable garden and insisted they grow carrots, because rabbits like them. Lena visited one Saturday afternoon with her camera. She took photos of Danielle and Andre on the porch, the garden in bloom behind them. "I want to end the series with this," she said. "People need to see what winning looks like." Danielle laughed. "Winning looks like pulling weeds and paying a mortgage." "Exactly," Lena said. Months passed. Andre's health continued to improve. He joined the local soccer team, his legs carrying him across the field, without the wheezing that used to slow him down. Danielle took a second certification course for her CNA work, aiming for a promotion. Every now and then she'd get an email from someone who had read Lena's articles, another tenant, another parent, another person who felt trapped in unsafe housing. They always said the same thing: "Your story gave me the courage to fight." She wrote back to every one of them. One warm evening in late summer, Danielle and Andre sat on the porch, watching the sun sink low. The air smelled faintly of grass and grilled food from a neighbor's yard. "Mommy?" Andre asked. "Yeah? Do you think the monsters are gone forever?" She looked out at the quiet street, the solid walls of their home, the life they'd built piece by piece. "I think they'll always try to come back somewhere. But as long as we stand together, we can keep them out." Andre leaned against her. "Good, I don't like monsters." "Me neither," she said, wrapping an arm around him. They sat in comfortable silence until the streetlights flickered on, the sky deepening to blue. Inside, the house was warm and dry, its walls clean and safe. No smell of damp, no creeping patches, no hidden dangers. For the first time in a long time, Danielle allowed herself to believe in permanence. The fight had changed her. It had taken everything she had, but it had also given her something back. A voice, a community, a home. And as the crickets began their night song, she knew one thing for certain: the monsters might still exist in the world, but they were no longer in hers.